That night, unusual events took place in the estate of the emperor and his empire, Rapian. On the ruler's bedside table stood a bottle of red wine, poured into glasses for relaxation. The guy with the beautiful body himself asked with interest why the girl next to him didn't want to raise her head. At that moment, the heroine was only thinking that she was lost, since she had no way out of this situation. The whole point was that she was in the bedroom of her newly made husband, whom she was seeing for the second time in her life. In front of her, standing completely calmly, was the strongest and most beautiful emperor named Linnell Edpa. Moreover, the man left the lady no other choice but to spend her wedding night with him right now. Linnell leaned over the bewildered heroine and said that she had a face like she was hiding something, but she didn't tell Miss that she was an ordinary servant who had secretly arrived as the Empress's deputy. Just 2 days ago, in the Chatanil Empire, the heroine was tidying up the princess's bathroom. Suddenly, a servant girl she knew ran to Zelda Fontrova, which made the girl break away from her work. Bonus asked why her friend was working if the mistress was nowhere to be seen, to which she replied that she could not leave things as they were. Fontrova then asked what had happened, and the maid explained that Prince Tesler had called her to him. When the lady began to resist because she had not cleaned everything, Bonus declared that she would clean it herself and pushed her out the door. As a result, Zelda headed to the prince's office, although she had absolutely no idea why he might suddenly need her. The heroine was more than sure that the cheerful Hale had probably come up with some new oddity. As she walked down the corridor, the lady noticed that angry and quiet whispers began to be heard behind her. This was yet another time when the other maids, who were purer in pedigree than she, called Miss a lowborn. However, the heroine tried, as always, not to pay attention to such things, because she knew that no one would shut up. Standing in front of the prince's door, Zelda took a while to gather her courage out of worry, and then finally knocked. The guy was already impatiently waiting for the maid, so he immediately invited the one who asked to come into his office. Seeing that it was indeed Fontrova, Tesler jumped up to greet her joyfully. Noticing that the girl was acting a little strange, Hale asked if she was really that happy to see him. But before the lady had time to answer, the guy suddenly said that he had called her because he had found a wonderful opportunity for her. At the same time, the prince was sure that Zelda would definitely highly appreciate his efforts and care for her. To the girl's great surprise, Hale suddenly asked her to marry Emperor Rapian and become the Empress's deputy. The shock that overcame her made Fontrova even jump up on the spot, since she had never expected anything like this in her life. And Tesler took Miss by the hand and said that now she was the only one he could trust with such a task. So, kissing Zelda's hand, the prince once again asked her to be at least a little in the place of Empress Rapian. But the heroine remembered very well that Princess Rosilia herself, who was distinguished by her beauty, was supposed to go on this mission. Putting his hand to his face sadly, the boy explained that his sister had run away about a week ago in search of love. What angered him most was that Lady Hale had left with a mere hired knight, which he considered unforgivable. Only now did the maid realize why His Majesty was so desperately asking her for something like this. This urgent need for a union was linked to the history of the continent, which occurred approximately 300 years ago. At that time, the Earth was one solid piece of land, but due to an incredibly strong thunderstorm and lightning, a crack eventually formed, and this huge crevice was later called the Terrible Lair of the Terrible Wyverns, or the Gorge of Death. To defend itself against these monsters, any empire needed military power more than anything else. That is why the weak kingdom of Chatanil so much hoped to unite with the strong empire of Rapian through the wedding. Moreover, the young Emperor Linnell himself recently proposed such an alliance to the royal family of Hale, so Tesler said that if they missed this marriage, the offer would quickly go to another country. Clenching her hand into a fist in excitement, the miss reminded the prince that she was just an ordinary servant of the princess. Besides, Zelda never forgot about her scar for a moment, and was sure that with such a face, no one would like her. To this, the guy confidently said that if the girl agreed to play the role of the Empress, he would give her a potion that would get rid of the scar. For the heroine, such a proposal was very important, because she wanted to be beautiful so much. The prince said that he himself only recently learned that there is a potion that temporarily removes all scars. Fontrova thought hard, because she considered this exchange of her freedom for subsequent beauty to be advantageous. The girl understood that in this way, the emperor would not even see her scar, and she would then be able to dissolve the marriage. Horrible images of some vague silhouette reminding her of its position appeared in the heroine's head. After that incident as a child when she was cursed, she ended up with this horrible scar. Tesler at this point pressed the lady a little, asking if she agreed. But the maid still had questions. The girl asked whether it would be easy for her to divorce the ruler of Rapian, since he would not know that she was only a deputy. The prince was sure that when his sister returned and Linnell saw her, this whole situation would resolve itself. Fontrava concluded that the princess's beauty and origins were truly invincible. Here, leaning towards his assistant, Hale suddenly whispered that her future husband, according to rumors, was not interested in anyone in bed. Although the heroine was very surprised by this, she understood that it would be even better for her. Hearing that if the miss changed her mind and did not want to step down as empress, her scar would appear, she asked if this was a threat. But His Majesty declared that he had not threatened at all, but had merely offered a good and profitable deal. Plus, he promised to give Zelda a cure that would remove the scar forever. And that was what Miss wanted more than anything in the world. Tesler confidently said that such a thing really does exist, but in order to obtain it, the maid must act exactly according to plan. However, the heroine still could not believe that she would finally be able to get rid of this terrible feature of hers. To make this dream come true, the lady said she agreed, and Hale was incredibly happy that his plan had worked. Fontrava asked when she needed to leave, and the guy, with a smile on his face, said right now. As a result, in just a couple of days, the miss managed to get to the Empire in a carriage, and even played her wedding, and now she sat in front of her husband and had no idea how to behave, because she had not yet gotten used to her situation. At that moment, Edpa approached his wife, and, gently placing his hand on her face, said that they would soon have their first wedding night. Zelda was very surprised to hear this, because according to the prince's stories, nothing like this should have happened. However, the emperor had already pushed the girl onto the bed, which she did not even have time to begin to resist in any way. Linnell noticed the lady's nervousness and said with a smile that she was much hotter than he himself had thought about her all this time. While the guy was moving so confidently towards her, the maid could not believe that all this was really happening to her. And Linnell leaned over his wife and tenderly promised that he would definitely fulfill his marital duty tonight. The heroine blushed deeply from such frank words, because she did not know that she would have to get so deeply into the role of a wife. Zelda sincerely believed that, because the emperor was not interested in anyone, she would be able to avoid the first night. Here the guy suddenly slowed down and said that he knew that he didn't like the lady as much as he didn't like her. For some reason, he became confused and timidly began to say that Miss simply did not make his heart skip a beat. It only now dawned on the maid that this man was used to being the center of attention, which was why he was behaving like this. Linnell looked even more cute and handsome at the moment, due to his temporary embarrassment. The ruler noticed the lady's gaze, but said that it would not help improve their relationship. But Zelda suddenly stopped listening to her husband almost completely, because she felt herself getting hot. The maid tried to pretend that she was very tired, because she hoped that then His Majesty would not touch her. Edpa noticed the Empress's state, but interpreted it to mean that she simply did not listen to him at all. And indeed, the girl suddenly turned to the guy, and with a sad expression on her face, asked what he had just said. For some reason, the Emperor turned away in embarrassment and asked his wife not to make a face, as if she was about to burst into tears. What Linnell was most unhappy with was that he had to perform rituals of worship to the gods. Realizing that he had been muttering all sorts of things out loud, the Emperor explained that he was simply angry at the customs of the priests. The heroine was surprised to notice that her newly made husband was worried about her because she thought that he was colder. Looking at the guy, the lady concluded that he was much more reasonable and kinder than she expected, listening to the rumors of others. So Zelda even found the strength to smile sweetly at the Emperor, although she was only his wife for a time. Linnell didn't expect the girl to be the first to suggest that he talk to her in a way that would be convenient for him, and the maid had already outlined a plan in her head, according to which she had to hold out until the princess was found. Unexpectedly, His Majesty smiled and said that he never thought that his wife would be so talkative. The heroine was very surprised to notice that the emperor's mood and behavior had suddenly changed dramatically. The guy himself looked into the lady's eyes and asked, quite seriously, if she believed that gods exist. Fontrov stared at Edpe in amazement, not understanding how much he believed in what he was asking her. Here, the ruler looked somewhere to the side and said that they had already arrived, which ultimately frightened the heroine greatly. She asked with concern in her voice who exactly had arrived, and now it was Linnell's turn to be surprised that the miss didn't know. Imagine the assistant's surprise when she learned that, in the emperor's family, the first wedding night was shown to the priests. No one had warned Miss about this at all, so she froze in place in complete shock. At that moment, those same priests arrived, knocked on the door, and asked permission to enter. The emperor immediately let them in, although Zelda suddenly began to desperately resist such a decision. In response, the guy asked the empress not to worry, because he was only going to portray their actions anyway. When the maid asked what he meant, the ruler raised his hand and pulled the rope tied to the bed. Literally, a few seconds later, the couple was surrounded by a lilac fabric, hiding them from everyone. Linnell explained that this was his plan, and the lady simply needed to tolerate his presence for a little while. Having satisfied himself that Fontrov had no further objections, Edpa turned again to the door and invited the priests in. The three main representatives of the temple immediately appeared in the room, but said nothing when they saw the curtain. His Majesty declared that the priests would see only their silhouettes and would also read prayers and leave. Zelda only now realized that the emperor had decided to deceive the servants of God a little and play out a bed scene with her. But the heroine didn't expect that in the end, the guy would say that he really needed her help. While the miss blinked her eyes in bewilderment, Edpa managed to partially undress and was now carefully hovering over her. With a hint of regret in his voice, Linnell suddenly said that in order to convince the priests, they would have to kiss. The maid decided that if such a small thing was needed, then she was quite ready for something like this. The only thing the lady prayed for now was for the whole tradition to end soon. Suddenly, the heroine felt something that she had been afraid of for a long time and hoped that she would not feel for as long as possible. Her husband didn't even suspect what his wife was thinking, so he behaved as relaxed and calm as possible. And Zelda herself suddenly realized that her body was burning again, which periodically happened to her because of the curse. Linnell thought that the girl was frowning so much because she was unhappy with everything that was happening. Leaning over the lady, he whispered that the Empress was playing her part too well. But Fontrov couldn't say anything in response to him because her whole body seemed to be burning alive. As a result, the assistant didn't even notice how the guy simply went and kissed her, but mechanically gave herself up to his lips. Suddenly, it dawned on the heroine that the heat was gone, causing her to open her eyes in complete shock. Zelda even had the impression that some kind of magic had happened to her from this kiss with the Emperor. Only after a few minutes did Linnell manage to tear himself away from his wife's lips and looked at her slyly. The lady herself was flushed from a recent bout of fever and a kiss with her new husband. Having woken up, the boy and the girl jumped up, realizing that the priests had already left long ago, and they were completely alone. Edpa couldn't understand what exactly made him kiss so passionately with a man he knew so little. To understand what was happening, the ruler turned to his wife and asked her to stay with him a little longer. Before the heroine had time to ask her husband anything, he suddenly kissed her again, but more briefly, after which His Majesty frowned, saying that something seemed strange to him, and this interested Zelda. Unable to bear it any longer, Fontrov extended her hands to the ruler, although she remembered that she herself was not allowed to get close to him. However, just like Linnell before, the maid also kissed him, trying to understand what she herself wanted to know. At this moment, in the Chatanal Empire, the prince was wondering out loud whether the lady had coped with her wedding night. Tesler understood perfectly well that the girl could now very well curse him for not telling him everything. However, it was important to Hale that the miss go to the Emperor voluntarily, so he deliberately hid something. This is all because, near the Gorge of Death, some strange movement began again due to the flying wyverns. The heir took a glass of wine in his hand to at least somewhat drown out his worries about the approaching war. The guy believed that he had done everything he could to protect his empire, even if it was at someone else's hands. And the fact that the victim he had chosen turned out to be flawed did not bother the prince at the moment. The assistant asked His Majesty, somewhat anxiously, what he planned to do after all this. Tesla responded with a slightly evil smile, but did not answer exactly what plans he had for Zelda, and the newlyweds were still in bed, enjoying each other's touches. What surprised Lindell most was that when he touched the Empress, his body instantly became warm. But the heroine herself did not know the answer to this question, since she absolutely did not understand what was happening between them. However, for some reason, whenever she touched the guy, she felt pleasantly cool. As a child, ever since the girl received the burn, she suffered from excruciating fever quite often. The curse that haunted her even instantly heated up the cold water as soon as the lady climbed into the bathtub. At that moment, Edpa said that for some reason, he was unable to stop the kiss at that moment, which pulled the miss out of her thoughts. In fact, Zelda felt the same as the Emperor himself, although she did not want to admit it. And His Majesty suddenly said with a sweet smile that the Empress seemed so pleasantly warm to him. A little later, as they lay together, holding hands, Linnell told them that he had always lived in bitter cold. After these words, which were difficult for him to say, the guy fell silent for a while and squeezed his wife's hand tighter. And then he suddenly admitted that when he kissed Zelda, he felt as if spring had come around. The heroine, with her mouth slightly open, listened as if enchanted to all these confessions of the ruler, which she did not even suspect. And Edpa jumped up and declared that he had not imagined it at all, and that his body had really become very hot. Only now did the husband notice the bewilderment on his wife's face, and guessed that she again knew nothing. So His Majesty sighed with displeasure, and said that this was precisely why imperial marriages were so full of lies. To get closer to the lady, Lindell began to tell a story about how 3 years ago he fought near the Ravine of Death. Then the guy set himself the goal that he would win this brutal fight, no matter what it cost him. And so, at the decisive moment, a Ma appeared before His Majesty, who knew how to control wyverns. Edpa immediately realized that he had to eliminate this man, otherwise his squad would lose this battle. Therefore, without a second's delay, the Emperor was the first to rush into battle, despite the difference in size. He actually managed to catch the magician off guard, and even wound him, but he managed to cast a spell. The enemy pointed his hand straight at the ruler and trapped him in magical rays, which Edpa was able to reflect with difficulty. At the end of the story, Linnell said that the mage was eventually able to cast a curse on him, and Zelda immediately asked what kind of curse it was. Although His Majesty had already decided to be sincere with the girl, further words were not easy for him. Only after a few minutes did he admit that he should have been frozen into the ice forever and never come back to life. However, Linnell managed to avoid the full curse due to the fact that he himself had magic, but his body temperature was now low. The Emperor admitted that this was why he was so surprised when he first touched his wife's hand. Fontrov guessed that this freezing curse was the opposite of her own, which is why they were good together. The heroine was able to understand that only when they touched did their bodies finally return to normal. But the lady was not yet going to admit that she was cursed, since she was temporarily the guy's wife. Noticing that Zelda had somehow shrunk down, the ruler asked if the Empress was very surprised. But the maid assured His Majesty that she felt very comfortable being with him. Then Linnell took Fontrov's hands and admitted that he felt not just comfortable, but incredibly wonderful. Kissing the lady's hand, the ruler hoped that the miss truly shared his emotions and feelings. The heroine watched Edpa's actions in surprise, since what she saw was different from what she had heard earlier. Just as Zelda was beginning to realize that the guy was better than she thought, he grabbed her hand tightly in his. This made the husband and wife very embarrassed, so they began to fuss about on the bed to get ready for bed. However, because of everything that the maid had learned, it was very difficult for her to sleep that evening. Then the girl heard the Emperor calling her very hesitantly, so she immediately responded. And the guy asked Zelda, when she turned to him, if they were spouses, which the miss confirmed, after which, looking at the Emperor's satisfied face, the lady added that it was unfair to attack him in the face like that. In response, Linnell smiled and stated that, as husband and wife, they could hold each other's hands without any permission at all. Zelda was noticeably embarrassed by these words, and even blushed a little, but still agreed with the ruler. Edpa admitted that he had not slept so sweetly in warmth for a very long time, without using a magic stone. The heroine also felt similar pleasant emotions because her husband's voice greatly calmed and lulled her. The next morning, when Miss was almost awake, she, to her surprise, discovered something she did not expect. For some reason, unfamiliar girls suddenly burst into her room, as if this was how it was supposed to be. They stood in a row and, with smiles on their faces, greeted the Empress and wished her good morning. But Fontrov was terribly unhappy because these ladies suddenly woke her up for some reason. The girls declared that they were the mistress's servants and therefore would accompany her from today onwards. The heroine thought about how ignorant these assistants had acted and therefore smiled. The strangers began to introduce themselves one by one, giving their names, and the first was Melanie Hetzros. The next one, who bowed politely to the Empress, introduced herself as Pesolini Asto, and the last one said that her name was Rosie Adelida, a very timid and somewhat frightened red-haired lady. Zelda absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear and said that she wouldn't give her name, since everyone already knew her, after which the Emperor's wife asked who dared to let these girls into her bedroom without permission. This cold tone greatly frightened the assistants, so they froze in confusion, not knowing what to say. Fontrova promised herself that no matter how long she was here, she would not allow herself to be treated so disrespectfully. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, Melanie smiled ingratiatingly and said that they had allowed themselves to do so. The heroine realized that these ladies were too impudent, and she needed to deal with this first. Pesolini suddenly announced that they had all already been chosen as the Empress's maids, and this was immutable. But for Zelda, this fact in no way justified the fact that the misses entered her room without knocking. The former maid decided to play a cunning role and therefore hinted at the first wedding night. The assistants were noticeably embarrassed by this, after which the lady stated that only she gives permission to visit her room. In the end, Melanie was the first to ask the ladies for forgiveness, saying that they had not meant to offend her at all. Pesolini suddenly tried to ease the heavy atmosphere by saying that she would prepare breakfast. Hetzros interrupted the conversation and said that the Emperor was very picky, so he only wanted to see beautiful people around him, after which the maid asked if the mistress herself had not felt something similar that night. In her eyes, Linnell was a very cold and dispassionate person who easily broke women's hearts. Following her, the other maids also began to chatter about the ruler's interests, but the heroine expected a similar reaction. She knew perfectly well what she had to do next, although she didn't want to go that far. While Melanie was talking about Linnell, the lady suddenly said that she needed help, and this surprised the lady. Then the heroine continued her performance and pretended that she could hardly stand after the previous night. The assistants immediately ran up to her worriedly and asked if the Empress really did not need help. Zelda, however, ignored them and said that she felt that the ruler knew how to handle women. The maids were astonished when Fontrov said that they would only be able to understand her condition when they themselves got married. Melanie was especially upset by all these words, so much so that she even clenched her hands into fists. At the end of her speech, the Empress stated that she had not given her consent to the girl's presence, so she would discuss it with her husband. As a result, the three assistants found themselves in the dust, although they thought they would be able to make fun of the new girl. And the heroine herself smiled sweetly at them and asked them to leave her room so that she could rest. As a result, sitting down to drink tea a little later, Zelda felt as if she had been in a war. Then, a servant named Sharon knocked on the lady's door and entered, which made the lady very happy. The Empress immediately realized that she would be able to get along with this assistant, so she was pleased. Fontrov asked this girl what criteria they used to select personal servants in this empire, and Sharon helpfully immediately informed them that it was the Emperor who chose them by his decree. Zelda thought about it when she heard this, because in her empire, the Empress personally chose her maids. Here, the assistant reported that Linnell invited his wife to have lunch together today in the main palace. This news pleasantly surprised the girl, since she was just thinking about meeting her husband. Sharon offered to prepare the bath before the meeting, and the lady agreed, asking that the water not be heated for her. This greatly surprised the maid, because she knew that even in summer, the water would be quite cool. But what scared the assistant most was that Fontrov suddenly asked her to choose the dress. The lady smiled at the girl and said that she believed that she would be able to choose the perfect outfit for her. These words pleasantly surprised the maid, so she decided to justify the trust placed in her at all costs. After stumbling a couple of times, the assistant sincerely promised that she would do everything possible to find the most beautiful dress. By lunchtime, Zelda was completely ready to meet the Emperor, as she was shining with her beauty. Since she still had a little time left, the heroine decided to take a walk, when suddenly she was distracted. Fontrov was very surprised when she heard that a visitor had come to see her who wanted an audience. It turned out that Duke Martins Rohain from the Chatanil Empire had personally arrived in the Rapian Empire. The lady had no reason not to talk to him, so she came forward to meet him, and the guy immediately delicately kissed her hand. Trying to be polite and pretend they didn't know each other, Zelda said that today was the beginning of a new destiny for her. In fact, Martins was a special knight watching over the heroine under the orders of Prince Tesler. It was he who accompanied her to the Empire. Although he had no desire at all to communicate with a commoner girl, the lady still remembered that during their entire journey, the guy never even looked at her. Therefore, the miss immediately understood that the Duke must have had a reason for such a dialogue and offered him some tea, after which she asked directly what Rohain wanted, and he asked how the girl spent her wedding night. At the same time, although the guy was smiling brightly and widely, the lady saw how implausible his grin was. But Zelda decided to play by his rules, so she also asked, as if by chance, if Princess Chatanel had been found. Instead of answering directly, the Duke leaned forward a little and asked if the lady would like this. The Empress's deputy shuddered all over, as she did not expect such an unpleasant question. The heroine did not understand what exactly this cold and insidious Martins meant when he asked about this. Fontrov knew perfectly well that she had to say that she hoped for the princess to be found soon. But the image of Linnell popped into her head, and the lady realized that she didn't want to leave at all. The Duke noticed this at once and, smiling, said that the miss had become too quickly accustomed to her position. Only now did Zelda realize how easily she had given away all her thoughts with her own emotions. But the guy suddenly announced that he was not going to report his observations to Prince Tesler. But no matter what Martins told her, the heroine would never trust him. She noticed that Rohain treated her as frivolously as he did the other girls in the palace. And even the maids themselves clearly underestimated the Empress, who was going to correct this. Zelda decided once and for all that she would defend her position even from the prince who was close to her. So the lady put the cup down on the table with a loud bang and said that she had not expected such carelessness from the Duke. Martins was noticeably confused when, instead of fear, he felt such an attack from Miss. Rohain was not at all used to the fact that for some reason he lost in dialogues, but now he had no choice. All because Fontrov suddenly advised the guy to be more careful with his expressions while she was Empress. The Duke laughed openly in response, as he had no idea that the lady could speak so well, to which the heroine replied that she had not had the opportunity to talk to him before, because they had only exchanged glances. Martins only now finally realized how much he was backed into the wall, so he began to make excuses. But suddenly, Sharon came into the room with a cart containing various goodies. The Empress was more than ever pleased with her assistant, who suddenly interrupted her conversation with the Duke, and the maid suddenly reported that the Emperor asked what his wife was doing now. But what pleased Miss most was the mention that Linnell had given orders to prepare her favorite dishes for dinner. Martins, listening attentively to this dialogue, noticed that the ruler devoted too much time to his wife. The Empress herself was pleased with Sharon's behavior, because now the guest was aware of her relationship with Edpa. Turning to Rohain, Zelda had no doubt that he had made the right conclusions and would now follow her rules. It was impossible to tell what the guy was thinking from his still emotionless and cold eyes. However, the Duke suddenly clasped his hands on his knees and said that he was not very good at judging people. After which, Martins explained that he was sure that it would be difficult for the maid in the role of Empress, but it turned out to be the opposite. The Emperor's wife immediately guessed that Rohain would definitely pass this information on to Prince Hale, and the Duke himself decided to end the dialogue at this point, since he had already learned everything he wanted. However, the guy's lips twitched uncertainly when the lady suddenly asked how long he would stay here, after which, with a poisonous smile on his face, he said that he would always follow His Majesty. When it was time for lunch, the heroine was able to fully collect her thoughts and came to the dining room in a good mood. She understood that now she needed to focus on the upcoming dialogue with her husband. The Emperor at this moment looked as irresistible as always, although he seemed very cold at first glance. Following the rules of etiquette, Zelda bowed to her husband and greeted him gallantly before approaching the table. Only after this did the girl finally raise her head and look around, ultimately being very surprised. The lady could not even imagine that at lunch with the ruler, she would meet her unsuccessful morning assistants. Melanie, as always, was the first to bow to the Empress, as if her morning anger had never happened. But Fontrov herself could not so easily accept the fact that she saw all these faces again. Then His Majesty called the girl and told her to quickly take a seat at the table next to him. He asked the lady if she liked her quarters, and she replied that she would like to change a few things, hinting at the useless maids. The guy listened in surprise as the miss said that her room lacked warmth and love. He asked who had the power to give this love, and Zelda hinted that the Emperor could come to her more often. The maids' faces immediately changed, because the last phrase sounded like flirting, which was unacceptable. Realizing this, the heroine immediately became embarrassed and asked her husband to forget about her last words. But then, to the girl's great surprise, Linnell declared that he would definitely come to her as often as possible. Noticing that his wife was embarrassed, the husband asked if she was joking, and the lady replied that everything was fine. Here they both started talking about last night, which immediately threw the assistants nearby out of their equilibrium. And Linnell himself, quite shamelessly, declared that he would like to repeat right now everything that happened last night. Zelda didn't understand why the ruler started to speak so frankly, because she didn't believe that he could start helping her. Here, Edpa abruptly changed the subject and asked why the maids were in the dining room, but they were unable to answer clearly. After hearing all this, the Emperor suddenly said that it would be better if his wife chose her own personal assistants. Melanie realized where this was going and tried to object to it, but Linnell asked everyone to leave. When they were alone, the guy suggested that the girl eat quickly before everything got cold. At the same time, he mentioned last night again, as he tried to play his role convincingly. So Hetzros, who had been trying to eavesdrop on the gentleman's conversation until the very end, pursed her lips in displeasure. Unexpectedly, Edpa admitted that there was something that interested him greatly, and he decided to ask directly. The guy looked at his reflection in the wine and asked if he was still not her type, as he had been 2 days ago. But the heroine was sure that she had never met the ruler before the wedding, so she didn't understand what he was talking about. Suddenly, Linnell repeated her recent words, which made the girl open her eyes wide in surprise. Only now, looking at His Majesty, did the miss realize that he was very similar to the recent stranger. But Zelda could not even imagine that 2 days ago, when she was diligently hiding, fate brought her together with her future husband. He was wearing a cloak and a hood over his face, as he too tried to hide his identity that day. What frightened the Empress's deputy most in this situation was that her husband could see her scar. The fact is that in the company of the Duke of Rohain, the lady arrived at a small settlement of the Rapian Empire 2 days ago. The girl still had a scar on her face at the time, as she had just arrived to get medicine for it. Martins got out of the carriage after the maid and said that they had definitely come to the right place. As God-forsaken as it looked, it was a magic shop named after Mr. Big. The Duke, just in case, told the lady once again that although he didn't look very good on the outside, he was a very skilled craftsman on the inside. It was rumored that this mage could provide absolutely everything from magical items to simple potions. The heroine just thought that she didn't know of any such place to get rid of a scar. But deep down inside, Zelda still didn't believe that such a thing was possible. To test everything on personal experience, the future Empress said goodbye to Martins for a while. Rohain silently watched the girl, since he still had no intention of helping her in any way. At that moment, Fontrov, somewhat hesitantly, although decisively, opened the door of the magic shop. Almost immediately, the secretary of a skilled magician met her and asked how he could help the new customer. The girl walked up to the counter and immediately put a bag of money on the table to show that she was serious. The guy immediately recognized what kind of remedy the lady had come for, so he asked her to follow him. At that moment, Miss passed by another man in a cape, who turned around to look at her, although she did not notice. The wizard Mr. Big was already sitting at his desk, waiting for Zelda to decide to approach. The girl removed her hood in front of him, since there was no longer any point in disguise, and looked at the vial in front of her. The magician told the lady to first make sure the potion was effective, and she obediently drank it, after which the man handed Miss a mirror and offered to look at herself, which she did not refuse. Imagine Zelda's surprise when a girl with a completely normal face looked at her from the mirror. At first, the heroine didn't even believe what she saw and awkwardly touched her now smooth skin. All her life, Fontrov had dreamed of this moment when she would be able to see herself beautiful, and now it had come. The girl now could not understand why she had suffered all this time, if it was so easy to get rid of the scar. Here, Big reminded that the effect of the potion was temporary, and now he had only prepared a month's supply. Zelda replied, disappointed, that she wished she had bought a lot more of the item so that it would last longer. But the gentleman disappointed the lady by saying that so much could not be cooked at once, so she simply had to order more of it. Just in case, the miss asked if the magician could completely heal her from the scar, but he answered negatively. While waiting for her to be given all the vials of potion, the heroine sat down on the sofa, partially pressing down on the newspaper. She became interested, so she read it, and was disappointed that they managed to write about the future empress in the paper. Suddenly, Fontrov heard a pleasant male voice from her side, and therefore turned around with curiosity. It turned out that there was some unknown guy sitting with her who asked if the miss knew well about the emperor's tastes. This stranger seemed very handsome to the maid, especially because he smiled very mysteriously. Zelda was surprised by this question, but still answered that men's tastes were quite simple. But the guy didn't back down and asked if the lady was too sure about the ruler's tastes. The assistant noted that he spoke as if he knew Linnell, and the stranger briefly confirmed this, after which this man brazenly declared that Edpa's tastes were clearly not the same as the girl's own. These words touched the heroine, who was already in a bad mood because of the scar, so she jumped up on the spot. Just at that moment, the secretary brought the lady her order, which she ended up being very happy about. Turning to the stranger, Zelda expressed the hope that the emperor had been much more polite than he had been. She mentioned that the princess doesn't like such people, and then it was the guy's turn to get angry at Fontrov's words. But the maid smiled and said that she certainly knew more about the tastes of the emperor's daughter than any customer in the store. This greatly surprised the stranger, for it had hit the mark, though he did not wish to admit it. And finally, Zelda grinned slyly and told the guy that the emperor was not her type either. Right now, Linnell smiled slyly and asked Miss if she had finally started to remember everything. In response, the empress, with a gloomy expression on her face, said that she did not expect to meet in such a place. Miss realized that she had not recognized the ruler at all because he was wearing a hood. Here, when the guy asked what kind of medicine she had bought, the girl began to tremble again. Zelda couldn't immediately think of what to answer, so she began to stutter incomprehensibly due to nervousness. To the miss's surprise, the emperor himself suddenly suggested the reason to her, asking if she had really become ill, after which Linnell admitted that the girl really did look unwell on their wedding night. Hearing this, Zelda felt relieved because she realized that Edpa had not noticed the scar on her face. So she took advantage of the situation and said that she was just going to get a light tonic, after which Fontrov quickly changed the subject and asked how the ruler ended up in that store. To this, His Majesty calmly replied that he simply went to get some medicine for hypothermia. However, a little later, it seemed to him that the lady's hands worked much better than all similar medicines. The heroine felt pleased when she realized that Linnell had decided to purchase this product for her sake. The guy nodded and admitted that he really wanted to make a good impression on his wife. Edpa finally said that he wanted the miss to be more relaxed about him and the empire. After hearing all this, the heroine still could not understand why her husband cared about her so much. Zelda didn't want to believe at all that the emperor treated her this way because he actually loved her. So the heroine reminded herself that she was only a temporary empress, so she could not succumb to her husband's influence. When their conversation was almost over, the ruler said that he did not need medicine, which greatly surprised the miss. Linnell leaned towards his wife and said that he was not cold because he had the hottest girl next to him. He asked if Fontrov could hold his hand every night, and she quietly agreed. That evening, Sharon showed the lady around all the rooms before sending her off to an important tea party. The maid understood that the lady would have difficulties, so she suggested that they rest, but the Miss decided to go inside straight away. In this room, everything seemed so frightening and huge to the heroine that she did not know where to look. The deputy came to the conclusion that she personally did not fit into this space, but Princess Roselia would like it here. Remembering the Emperor's kind words, Zelda wondered if he would be even kinder to his real wife, rather than his temporary one. However, the lady quickly realized that this was none of her business, so she continued on her way after her assistant. A little later, Fontrov was already sitting among other noble ladies and was trying very hard to fit into their society. She even smiled sweetly and supported absolutely any topic, just so as not to separate herself from the group. But the lady didn't notice that Melanie was angrily watching all this from the side. The girl could not hide her malicious smile about the fact that she would soon come up with a plan to defeat the Empress. Closer to night, the heroine was so tired that she even decided to take a bath to make it easier to fall asleep later. With some excitement, Zelda remembered that His Majesty had also been busy all day. Here, realizing that for some reason she had been thinking about her husband, Miss immediately forbade herself to do so as not to worry. Then, Fontrov thought that it was unlikely that the guy would come to her this time, since they had already had their first wedding night. As a result, the Empress was so lost in her dreams that she didn't notice how hot the water had become. So the girl quickly climbed out of the water, which was already steaming hotly due to the temperature. A few minutes later, she was completely ready for bed and took a candle to light her way to bed. But then, before the lady could take a single step, her entire body was pierced by a sharp pain, foreshadowing a heat throughout the entire body. Zelda's vision immediately began to blur, as her health began to rapidly deteriorate. With instantly dry lips, Miss could barely utter a request that at least someone give her some water. Suddenly, Fontrov felt a pleasant coolness on her lips, which then began to spread throughout her body. It turned out that the ruler came to his wife and heard her desire to drink water as soon as possible. Not noticing anything around her, the girl at that moment of the kiss thought only about how good she felt. She even hugged her husband, instinctively pressing herself closer to him to cool herself down even more. Only after a few minutes did Zelda find the strength to tear herself away from His Majesty's lips. The guy laughed in response and asked if his wife had suddenly decided to greet him too boisterously. But the heroine could not find the words to describe her emotions, because she did not expect her husband to come. Linnell admitted that when he saw the girl's condition, he thought she was about to faint. So he picked her up and personally carried her to the bed, so that everything would definitely be okay with the Miss in the end. In response, Fontrov could only ask for forgiveness for accidentally making her husband worry about her. However, Edpa said with a smile that since they were a married couple, it was natural for them to take care of each other, after which he leaned over the surprised lady, who was gradually recovering from the attack. Without saying another word, the ruler kissed the Miss, who responded in kind, surprised. Every time she felt the Emperor's touch, Zelda felt much better. But then the image of Prince Tesler popped into the heroine's head, reminding her that she shouldn't have behaved like that. So Fontrov tried to order herself not to succumb even more to the seductive influence of His Majesty. Therefore, barely finding the strength in herself, the Empress turned to her side, which immediately alarmed the guy. The heroine asked her husband to go to his room, arguing that she was not feeling well that day. But, to the maid's great surprise, Linnell declared that they could hold hands, so he would stay close. These words pleasantly surprised Zelda, since she herself wanted to be close to this man. At the same time, in another estate, a young girl was reading an evil letter from her cunning ally. It stated that the Empress was completely ignorant of manners, which made the lady who read the message laugh. She smiled and asked out loud if Fontrov knew that the Emperor would soon take a concubine. The next morning, Zelda woke up very sweetly in her bed and was immediately greeted by Sharon. The maid informed her mistress that the ruler had left at dawn because he had state affairs. Touching the cool blanket, the Miss guessed that her husband had come to her despite being busy. This surprised the Empress's deputy, so much so that she almost missed the news that Edpa was waiting for her in the office during lunch. Then the assistant reported that Duke Rohain wanted to talk to the lady again, which she didn't like very much. Sharon looked like she wanted to say something else, although she didn't dare say it at the moment. The Empress was able to see this, and therefore excitedly asked the girl to tell her everything. Imagine the heroine's surprise when the maid informed her that candidates for concubines were invited to tea today. Zelda couldn't wrap her head around it. Since only a few days had passed since her wedding with Linnell, it seemed to her that such an unapproachable and insensitive man, at first glance, would postpone the question of other ladies. As for the Duke, Miss had no doubt that he had decided to talk to her precisely about concubines. What Fontrov feared most was that the guys had already decided everything and would simply inform her of their choice. All because just yesterday, His Majesty seemed so sweet and gentle to her, and even happy. But Zelda decided to throw all these thoughts out of her head, since she was still the deputy of the Empress. First of all, right now, the lady had completely different problems that she was about to face. When the heroine was announced, her face didn't even move a single muscle, because she didn't feel like smiling right now. She immediately saw among those present candidates for her personal maids, whom the Miss had already rejected, who were already familiar to her. Zelda knew that most of these ladies were from families that were supported and sponsored by the ministers. What bothered the heroine was not even the fact that all the girls started whispering about her, but the fact that they looked alike. As Fontrov had thought, none of the candidates were going to greet her, despite her status as Empress. However, Zelda, like no one else, knew that they had no right to ignore her, so they would have to say hello anyway. Since the heroine was the Empress of Rapian and proudly bore this title, no one dared to neglect her. In the end, the first one to bow to the lady was the usually timid and quiet Rosie, who was still afraid to speak. Following her, one after another, the candidates began to bow their heads before the ruler's wife standing before them. Fontrov pretended not to notice the awkward pause before and greeted everyone politely in return. When everyone had taken their seats, one of the candidates suddenly approached Miss and asked for forgiveness for not having talked earlier. The girl introduced herself as Catherine Cagliostro and said that she had wanted to meet the Empress for a long time. The former maid smiled in response and noted that since her new acquaintance was from a noble family, they would see each other often. After which His Majesty's wife suggested that they put all conversations aside for now and all drink tea together. No one objected, because they did not dare to contradict a lady who was higher in status. The only ones who didn't behave quietly and obediently, but looked at each other, were Melanie and Catherine. Suddenly, Cagliostro broke the silence and asked if Zelda knew that the Emperor's concubines would be chosen from among them. Fontrov was prepared for such questions, so she calmly replied that she had learned about it on the way to the tea room. Then, the possible maid asked if the Miss didn't feel offended because so little time had passed since the wedding. Melanie also joined the dialogue and said that she could express her opinion if the lady allowed her. Only after this, with a sly smile on her face, did Miss accidentally reveal that Catherine and Linnell had previously been engaged. Only now did the girl notice that these two had clearly become allies of each other and were against her. And what surprised her most was that her new acquaintance turned out to be His Majesty's former fiancé, something the lady did not know at all. It turned out that this information came as a surprise to the other candidates as well, as they began to discuss it. One of them even said out loud that Catherine herself could have become Empress, which was rather impolite. The girl immediately realized this, and therefore asked the lady for forgiveness for what she said without thinking. Cagliostro herself suddenly reminded us again that in the imperial family of Rapian, moreover, there were always many concubines. When Zelda heard that even Linnell himself was the son of one of the secondary wives, she froze in shock. The heroine could never have imagined that the ruler had such a difficult past and so little power now. Everyone around immediately noticed that the Empress was surprised, and they were horrified when they realized that she knew nothing. Only now did Zelda realize that all the candidates had prepared well in order to destroy her so easily. But then the lady's maid approached her and reminded her that it was time to go to her husband, which greatly saved the former maid. Barely concealing her joy at leaving this tense place, Fontrov announced that it was time for her to go. Of all those present, only Rose looked with sympathy after the Empress as she left the room. The heroine realized that if she were the Emperor's real wife, she would be much worse off now than she actually was. But before she could leave, Catherine suddenly called out to her and asked if the lady was really going to discuss the issue of concubines with His Majesty. Zelda turned around in surprise and asked if the girl really needed to know about this. to which she replied that it concerned her. The former maid froze in place, as she was completely confused and did not understand what was being discussed. Then Kalyasa explained what the miss did not know, and said that all those present were to become concubines. In the end, Fontrov simply ran out of the room, as she was frightened by the fact that everything had already been decided without her. What angered the Empress most was that her husband did not tell her anything at all, although he had the opportunity. Seeing the girl, Linnell immediately stood up from his seat with a joyful smile, since he had been waiting for her for a long time with impatience. The lady noted somewhat coldly that His Majesty was in a surprisingly good mood now. In response, the guy kissed the miss's hand and said that if she was going to come so beautiful, she could have told him. Edpa was very surprised when his wife said that he could have warned her about something, because the emperor did not know what it was about. Then, turning away, Zelda said that taking concubines was not a crime, so everything was fine. Hearing this, the ruler asked with concern on his face how she even knew that he would have more wives. The heroine honestly told her husband that at the morning tea party, the future concubines greeted her separately. When the lady listed the names of all the girls, His Majesty stood frozen in confusion, not knowing what to say. After a few minutes, Linnell muttered that he didn't want his wife to find out about it this way. Zelda again didn't understand Idp, so she asked anxiously what he had just meant. In response, the ruler stated that he was not so frivolous as to take concubines immediately after marriage. Imagine Fontrov's surprise when she learned that, for some reason, those candidates had acted without authorization. The boy explained that since he had ascended the throne, many ministers had been dissatisfied and had been discussing the issue of the legitimacy of power. He even had to involve the Chatanal Empire to at least partially restrain some of the indignant ministers. Only now did Zelda realize that the emperor had been given condition after condition, taking advantage of his precarious position. Linnell admitted that, having taken a lady from Chatonil as his wife, he was now forced to choose girls from the Rapian Empire. The heroine felt sorry for this guy, who was forced to pass off his concubine's child as the real heir. Moreover, a marriage with her could allow him to prepare for a possible war in the south. Zelda agreed that this was the best decision on Linnell's part, so as not to offend anyone as much as possible. But Miss couldn't understand why she was still upset, even after she was told everything. Here His Majesty said that one of the priests who came on the wedding night could well have spread rumors. Noticing the confusion on his wife's face, the guy explained that these were rumors about how passionately he had taken possession of her. Hearing this, the former maid blushed from head to toe, because she knew that everyone was telling a complete lie. Eventually, the lady remembered that they had a reason for this illusion that night, so they both played along with each other. Here, Edpa got down to business and said that he would like to teach a lesson to the ministers and candidates who decide everything without him. With a cheerful smile, the boy asked if the Empress would like to discuss this after the audience with the Duke. Miss agreed. So Rohina met her husband a little later, although she did not particularly want to. Martins immediately announced, sitting down at the table, that he had come about the concubines who had become bold. His Majesty immediately asked the Duke what mood all the ministers were in at the moment. The eyes of the incoming guest darkened unkindly, although this happened only for a short moment, so no one noticed anything, after which the guy said with a smile that they were all in a big hurry, but he understood their concern. Looking slyly at the Empress, Rohain explained that the question of an heir was a different matter entirely. The heroine herself knew that noble people would hardly want to see a child from a foreign wife as an heir. The lady also knew that the more descendants the emperor had, the stronger the family's influence became. The heroine understood perfectly well that if her position was unstable, then a divorce from her would not be difficult at all. So, looking at Martins calmly drinking tea, the lady concluded that he was not even going to be on her side. Unexpectedly, Linnell said that he was angry at having to take concubines so quickly, which surprised the deputy empress. The Duke asked anxiously whether, if it were not for the persistence of the ministers, the emperor would not have taken concubines at all. To this, Edpa stated with absolute certainty that he had never even thought of such a thing, so he had the right to be angry. Hearing this, Rohain was clearly not happy, and therefore looked anxiously at the former servant to help him. Only an embarrassed blush played on the girl's face, and she, due to her own worries, did not even look at the Duke. Then, with the Emperor's permission, Martin said that he had better resolve the issue with the concubines as soon as possible. Linnell asked with displeasure if a guest from another empire was really offering to accept secondary wives. In response, the guy stated that even the presence of concubines should not change anything for Ed P. if he himself did not want it. Only now did Zelda look into the Duke's eyes and realize that he was trying with all his might to make her situation worse. Fontrova understood perfectly well how problematic her life in the palace with the concubines would become. The former maid knew that her options would be limited, but she had to make it so that Linnell wanted to take concubines himself. Here the Duke reminded them that they had only 10 days to decide and asked what the Empress's opinion was. The girl immediately understood that she was required to push her husband to accept the correct opinion. So, although with sadness on her face, Zelda still admitted that there was some sense in Martin's words. Edpa asked his wife doubtfully to think again whether she would be okay with him accepting concubines. The heroine knew the answer too well, so she even clenched her hands into fists because she wouldn't like it. However, she could not tell the truth, so she amazed His Majesty by saying that everything would be fine with her. At the same time, the lady was even able to portray a joyful smile on her face, which did not correspond to her condition. Edpa became visibly angry when he heard Mrs. answer, and said that he did not know that his wife was so kind. After which, he stood up and said that, in that case, there was no reason to spoil relations with the ministers and delay the answer. The ruler called his secretary, and Raphael immediately appeared from the corridor, because he was always waiting nearby. His Majesty ordered his assistant to inform him that he would approach the ministers right now, and the boy nodded obediently. The Duke said with a smile that Linnell had made a wise decision, but Edpa did not want to hear anything about it. Before leaving, the Emperor asked his wife to stay with Rohain and talk to him as if he were a person from her empire. Although it was clear from Zelda that she herself was not happy with this decision, His Majesty had no intention of canceling anything. When he left, Fontrov hung her head, but Martin suddenly declared that she had done absolutely the right thing, after which he added that he had news for the lady, and the heroine immediately became interested in this. The Duke smiled mysteriously and said that this information from her native empire of Chatanel was completely fresh. At this moment, everything was quiet and calm in the imperial palace of Chatanel, since there was nothing to indicate panic. And in one of the rooms, on her soft bed, the found Princess Rosilia slept sweetly and peacefully. Since she had been found only recently, the prince was very concerned about the condition of his runaway sister. It turned out that the girl not only managed to get pregnant, but even gave birth. And this was a big problem. So Tesler asked for a potion to be made that would hide the fact that Rosilia was no longer an innocent. He couldn't understand how the girl dared to give birth to an unknown mercenary, being of good blood. Walking up to the lady's bed, Hale ordered his sister to turn towards him, as she herself was not reacting in any way. Since the miss did not obey the first time, the brother began to press even harder, but the girl stubbornly pretended that she did not hear anything. With a sigh, Tesler whispered that the princess must have completely lost her fear and gone out of her mind to behave like that. Suddenly, the lady jumped up and shouted that she had not agreed to any wedding with Emperor Rapian. Moreover, Rosilia was absolutely sure that this guy was much better than any of her suitors. Then the brother reminded that in the end, the lady abandoned this mercenary and returned back with the Imperial Knights. To this, Miss explained that living as a commoner turned out to be much more difficult than she thought. After which, through tears, the girl said that because of her pregnancy, she had no choice but to run away. Tesler only sighed heavily when he heard all this, since not a single word of hers pleased her in the least. Here, Rosilia asked her brother what happened to her man and child, because they had promised to simply let them go. Nothing moved in the boy's cold blue eyes when the miss asked this question, although he knew the answer to it. The whole point was that the prince personally took care of the mercenary by stepping on his hand with his boot at the edge of the cliff. As a result, the guy and the child fell from a great height, screaming that it was wrong. But Hale did not regret what he had done at all, since he believed that this mercenary was to blame for everything. At this point, Zelda anxiously asked when exactly the princess would arrive in the Rapian Empire. To this, the Duke replied that there were certain health problems with the princess, so she would be back later. The heroine remembered the sweet and handsome face of the Emperor and realized that she had very little time left with him. However, she knew she had no right to resist, so she agreed to wait for Rosilia to arrive. Unexpectedly, Martins announced that it was necessary to restore order among the concubines before the arrival of Hale's daughter. Zelda was surprised by this and asked why she had to do such a thing at all, since it was not part of her job description. In response, Rohain chuckled and said that it would be for the best for the former servant herself and for the future empress. Since the guy had finally started to irritate her, the Miss decided to end the conversation and walk away. But before the lady could do this, the guy stood up after her and gallantly offered to walk her home. As a result, Miss walked through the garden in such unpleasant company and tried to enjoy the views around her. Looking around out of the corner of her eye, the girl concluded that there was nothing unsightly in the imperial domain. Unexpectedly for herself, the lady accidentally overheard the conversation between the emperor and the possible concubine Catherine. The lady asked for forgiveness for something in the past, but the guy said that he hated those who had deceived him even once. The empress felt unpleasant that she had witnessed such a conversation because she did not like eavesdropping. Here, Caliasa stated that it was unlikely that the emperor had actually spent the first night, so she still had a chance. Unexpectedly for everyone, Linnell grabbed the lady by the chin and asked why she decided that at all, after which he angrily added that the girl should never dare to talk about his wife like that again. These words, which Zelda overheard, surprised her greatly, since she did not know that Edpa thought so of her. Noticing that the ruler was coming this way, Fontrov decided to go another way when the Duke specifically called out loudly to her. The heroine did not expect such a setup, so she looked back at Martins with concern. But it was too late, because His Majesty looked down the road and saw the Empress there. Not knowing what to answer him at such a meeting, the lady froze in place in complete confusion. What Zelda didn't like most right now was that Rohain had deliberately set her up, so she clenched her hand. Pretending that she was not there, the Empress hid behind the flowers, playing a children's game with her eyes closed. Embarrassed by such behavior, the ruler coughed and asked the girl to show herself to him immediately. So the heroine had to show herself from behind the flower and say that she ended up in this place completely by accident. Then Catherine approached the company and greeted the Empress, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. The girl, with a sly smile on her face, said that she would soon become the first concubine, and they would see each other more often. At this moment, listening to Caliasa's words, the Duke watched the former servant's reaction very carefully. Linnell suddenly noticed that his wife and Martins were walking together for some reason, and this caused discontent in the guy. But Fontrov explained quite calmly that Rohain was her interlocutor, so she didn't see anything special in the walk. After which, the Empress attacked her husband and said that he was already having fun with his future first concubine. In response, Linnell became somewhat angry and reported that each of them had communicated with a person from their empire. The girl had nothing to say to this, since His Majesty turned out to be, in essence, completely right. At this point, even Edpa ended the dialogue, because he did not want to quarrel with the lady anymore, although it had already happened. Unexpectedly, Zelda said that she was just about to return to her chambers, so she would not disturb the ruler's conversation. But before she could leave, the Emperor suddenly grabbed her hand and stopped her, which surprised her. But Fontrov pulled her hand out of the ruler's hands quite sharply. Although she said nothing, she immediately realized that she had crossed the line, so she turned away and apologized for her behavior. In the end, completely shocked by his wife's behavior and how everything ended, Edpa stayed where he was. The Duke smiled at him and informed him that the boy need not worry, since he would see Miss off himself. So as a result, Linnell was left alone with his future first concubine, which was what he didn't want the most. But Catherine, who silently watched everything that was happening, was completely satisfied with the outcome. At this point, Rohain was barely able to catch up with the lady, as she was walking very quickly, wanting to get as far away as possible. Miss asked what Martins wanted from her, and he said that he had come to see her off out of knightly duty. The lady said with displeasure that he had failed the knightly tests, which ultimately surprised the guy greatly. The Duke asked with displeasure where exactly the current Empress had learned this secret information. In response, the former servant stated that Prince Tesler told her about this, and there could be no other option. Rohain couldn't believe that Hale had set him up so badly, but His Majesty did know about it. In fact, Zelda knew about this not from the prince at all, but she saw no need to tell the Duke about it. Here the girl stated that she had heard that 3 years ago, Martins had had a forbidden affair with a widow. The Duke was both very surprised and angry when he heard what he had tried so hard to hide. And Fontrov herself said with a smile that in the Rapian Empire, there would probably also be widows for the guy. As a result, Rohain froze in place in shock, as he did not expect such impudence from the current empress. However, he pulled himself together quite quickly and said that the miss was indeed aware of his special preferences. The Duke kissed the lady's hand and whispered that she, too, might one day be among his candidates. But Miss broke free and ran away, as it was long past time for her scheduled bath. For some reason, thoughts kept creeping into her head that Catherine, too, was probably special to His Majesty. Zelda wasn't sure how exactly Linnell felt about the concubines he had taken on almost immediately after his wedding. She knew that this was normal for any ruler, and that she, as a temporary wife, did not need to worry. Only after a few minutes did the lady notice that the water in the bathroom had heated up too quickly this time. Then, completely unexpectedly for herself, Zelda heard Linnell's voice and turned around in surprise. In a panic, the Empress remembered that she needed to greet her husband, so she jumped up and wrapped herself in a towel. The guy realized that the girl had been calmly taking a bath all this time, and he had disturbed her somewhat by his arrival. The ruler asked if the lady had any foam in her bath, and she answered no, hearing him go away somewhere. Fontrov shouted that she was going to leave, but His Majesty ordered her to stay where she was. Finally, after a few seconds, she saw her husband's hand, who brought rose petals from somewhere. Smiling, the guy scattered petals over the surface of the water in the bathtub and said that it would be more convenient to talk that way. The heroine was very embarrassed by the Emperor's behavior and asked why he had come here at such a time. In response, Edpa asked if he really needed a reason to see his own lady. He admitted that he came unannounced because he was tired of always being greeted with preparation. As the lady sat shyly in the warm water of the bathtub, Linnell said it was an honor to meet her. The heroine would never have thought that she would hear such a thing from the Emperor, whom everyone called cold and unfeeling. Unexpectedly for the lady, the ruler suddenly touched her face and said that she was incredibly beautiful. But in response, Fontrov admitted that she felt awkward without makeup, as it was very unusual. Linnell's eyes darkened noticeably after his wife's words, as he thought completely differently. Without asking permission, the boy suddenly put his hand into the water to check how warm it was. Zelda asked what exactly the Emperor was doing, and he replied with a smile that he had brought too many petals, after which the guy deliberately threw a handful of them outside the bathroom, since they were cleaning it anyway. Miss watched Edp's actions in silence for a while, because she did not understand why he was doing all this. Suddenly, Fontrov noticed how she had become more open, which greatly embarrassed her, and she blushed noticeably. To stop His Majesty, the girl grabbed his sleeve with her hand and asked him to stop immediately. As a result, it so happened by chance that Linnell lost his balance and fell straight into the water towards Miss. Edpa was instantly wet, and Zelda saw how beautiful and powerful his body was. The guy himself wasn't upset at all. He just adjusted his wet hair so that it wouldn't get into his face. But the heroine was terribly embarrassed by what was happening, since she didn't want anything like that at all. His Majesty suddenly declared that the girl was the first to make him get so wet. Blushing even more than was possible, the miss closed herself off as much as possible from her husband, who had fallen towards her. Surprisingly calmly, the ruler suddenly said that since this had happened, he would have to do something, and this frightened the lady. She asked with concern what exactly her husband had in mind, but the Emperor did not answer and moved closer to her. Before Zelda could do anything, Linnell sat down behind her with satisfaction and said that they would now take a bath together. Edpa admitted that he did this because it was cold for him to wash alone, but he promised to behave decently. To his surprise, the boy suddenly noticed that the water had become hotter and therefore decided that a warming stone had been placed in it. Somewhat absent-mindedly, he plunged his hand into the water, trying to find the stone, but the lady, blushing deeply, declared that there was nothing in the bath. Then His Majesty apologized and admitted that he was surprised that the stone was so soft. Holding a few petals above the water on his hand, Linnell asked in confusion why the water remained so warm. Fontrov, somewhat confused, stated that this was all because the water was initially very hot, but the mist didn't take into account that when the guy got into the bath, the water should have cooled down instantly. And the emperor himself could not explain the reason why he was still warm, although he was usually cold. Edpa asked if it was because of the warmth of the lady's heart, and the former servant understood what it was all about. Only now did the girl realize that if her husband had not accidentally fallen into the bathtub, she would have gotten burned again. As Miss had already realized earlier, the two of them had something that they needed and could share with each other. Suddenly, the gentleman muttered how good it felt, because his muscles were finally relaxing after the workout. Zelda realized that he often went to training and suddenly asked how many people the guy killed in the war. The emperor admitted that he lives with the thought that the more enemies he kills, the fewer casualties there will be among his people. But then he explained that he was not at all a bloodthirsty killer, as one might initially think. The ruler admitted that he even needed the marriage with the miss to avoid war, and she asked if he regretted it. But in fact, Linnell did not regret at all that he had such a wife, which he said directly. The heroine was pleased to hear that her husband would try to make sure that she, too, would not regret marrying him. His Majesty himself, at that moment, sincerely believed in the words he had spoken, and therefore smiled happily. At the end of his speech, Edpa said that he was very glad that they were both in the bathroom, because they were able to talk calmly. Suddenly, he asked the girl to move forward a little, and she asked in shock what was happening. To the lady's great surprise, the ruler suddenly began to undress, although there was little point in this, since the clothes were already wet. Fontrov, seeing such actions, once again blushed deeply, although she did not turn her head away. True, in the end, the heroine couldn't stand it, and said that she would be the first to get out of the bathroom while her husband continued to wash. Edpa tactfully agreed to close his eyes while the lady changed her clothes, since they were not yet that close. But in the end, he couldn't hold back and still took a little peek, although the miss herself didn't see it. Quickly throwing on a spare towel, Zelda ran out of the bathroom as quickly as possible so as not to embarrass herself even more. Her actions brought a sincere smile to His Majesty, because he was pleased to see his wife. A little later, when they were both already in bed, the guy admitted that he had managed to freeze in such a short time. Reaching out his hand to the worried Empress, Linnell said that he really did feel much warmer when she was around. Fontrov did not answer, when suddenly, looking the girl straight in the eyes, the ruler asked her to move closer to him, since the heroine herself wanted this, to cool down more and at the same time warm up her husband. She obeyed. Touching the lady's face for the umpteenth time, Linnell noted that he used to have to swing his sword for a long time before he would fall asleep. Tucking a strand of hair behind the Empress's ear, the ruler hoped that while she was by his side, there would be fewer wars. The former maid thought sadly about what would happen when she eventually disappeared, and a real princess took her place. The only thing that consoled her was that very soon His Majesty would have 4 beautiful concubines. Moreover, Rasilia herself, who was famous for her beauty and excellent manners, will come to the Rapian Empire. However, right now, Edpa hugged his wife tighter and whispered that she should not leave him if she did not want wars. After which, he asked the lady not to quarrel with the concubines, because she was still his special wife. As sad as Zelda was about leaving soon, these words couldn't help but bring a sweet smile to her face. So at least at this moment, the heroine decided to enjoy such a pleasant moment with her current husband. About an hour ago, the night bodyguard informed his master that Linnell was in his wife's chambers. His name was Rolf, and he had orders from the very beginning to keep an eye on any actions of the newlyweds. The lord had served the Duke of Rohain faithfully all this time, and he told him about the ruler's behavior. Martins turned away thoughtfully and asked his assistant why the emperor had gone to see his wife at such a time. To this, Rolf replied that His Majesty might well have some urgent questions for Lady Zelda. The Duke did not believe that such a cold-blooded guy could have even the slightest hint of sexual needs. Rohain certainly couldn't have imagined that Zelda would be to the ruler's taste, but the knight was not surprised. Hearing from the bodyguard that Linnell had good taste, the Duke turned around and looked at him in surprise. Martins asked in bewilderment why his knight spoke as if Fontrova were beautiful. The guy was a little embarrassed by this question for the first time in a long time, but he understood that he would have to answer. Therefore, he remembered seeing the current empress during sword training, which had impressed him greatly at that moment. The knight even admitted that the lady was so good at this that he felt like a nobody. Only now did Rohain remember that Miss had recently told him that he had not been accepted into the knightly order. It immediately became clear to the guy that Zelda learned about everything not from Prince Tesler, but because she herself was a fencer. Rolf then reported that the mercenary they had found, whom the princess loved, was still in critical condition. The Duke was surprised that the boy was able to survive at all after such a difficult fall and several days of searching for him. But fortunately, everything was fine with the child, thanks to the fact that his father held him tightly in his arms. After thinking for a moment, the knight said that there was also unconfirmed information, and Rohain became interested in it. Imagine Martin's surprise when his bodyguard informed him that the mercenary Noton was not a commoner. It turned out that the precious stone on his sword contained some unusual seal from a completely different empire. The Duke immediately realized that it could be a seal used only by people of royal blood. Without a second thought, Rohain immediately asked Rolf to bring him this very sword as soon as possible. The next morning, when the heroine woke up after a sweet dream, she immediately felt someone's pleasant touch. A little later, opening her eyes, the mist discovered that the Emperor, who had long since awakened, was looking straight at her with a smile. Hugging the Empress tighter, Linnell said that he had slept very well, and she replied that she had also slept well. At this point, Zelda's eyes widened in surprise as she noticed that her husband was not wearing any clothes for some reason. Fontrov even jumped up in surprise, which did not escape His Majesty's notice. Having risen up on the bed after the lady, the guy calmly confirmed that he had even undressed at night because of the warmth. In response, the embarrassment that overwhelmed her made the heroine bury her face in the pillow, just so she wouldn't have to look. A little later, when they were having breakfast together, Linnell remembered this moment and said that he did not expect such a thing. Zelda immediately apologized for her behavior, but the ruler himself was not at all angry with her. Instead, he suddenly pushed the pie towards Miss and said that she simply had to try it. Edpa confessed that it was his favorite dish, and Fontrov immediately, obediently appreciated it, tasting its wonderful taste. The Emperor asked the girl how she would describe the taste, and she replied that she would not like to share it with anyone. Linnell laughed and said that he thought exactly the same thing when he first tried this pie in his life. He began to talk further on this topic, but Zelda, although she listened attentively, still understood little. Suddenly, His Majesty said that the concubines would be accepted next week, and the lady's hand froze in place. She realized that she would have to share her husband with all the girls, and said that he was not a pie. These words made the ruler so sad that he fell silent for a while, lost in his thoughts. Only a few minutes later, the guy remembered that he had a meeting soon, so he said that he would go first. But before that, he gave the Empress his part of the pie and said that he had not touched it at all, which surprised the lady. Fontrov, with a look of incomprehension on her face, recalled that her husband had said that he didn't want to share him with anyone. When the miss suddenly asked why the Emperor was giving the pie to her, he only smiled at her affectionately in response. Before the girl could say or do anything else, His Majesty unexpectedly came closer to her. Linnell hugged his wife tightly and tenderly, who still froze in place, confused, and continued to sit. In the end, Zelda couldn't stand it any longer and pressed herself against the ruler, who once again reminded her that she was his empress. At this point, Catherine was yelling at her assistants to tighten the already tight corset on her dress even more. The girl wanted to look her best at the ceremony, so she was extremely angry at the maids who were so poor in helping her. Looking at herself in the mirror, Miss smiled and thought that it was not in vain that she had chosen the wrong colors for the event, because they suited her. Her engagement to the Emperor was broken off when a secret affair with another man was discovered. However, Kaliasa still believed that no guy could resist her beauty, so it was only a matter of time. But then the image of Zelda, who had completely accidentally become empress in her place, popped into the concubine's head. Because of this, Catherine's face was instantly distorted again by anger and jealousy towards this lady from another empire. And now the only option to regain the favor was to give birth to a child for the Emperor. So Kaliasa decided to do whatever it took to make Fontrov eventually bow to her. 10 days later, the ceremony of accepting the concubines took place, which, as always, took place in the prayer room of the temple. Only this time, this room was located in a large and beautiful temple, which usually never happened. The ministers themselves insisted on this slight deviation from custom time, and again in their letters. Moreover, the Duke also tried very hard to speed up the approach of the ceremony. He not only communicated with ministers on behalf of the loyal subject Rapian, but even spoke publicly. Only Zelda was actually sad about this, although she carefully hid her emotions from everyone. The lady knew that all these actions were planned from the beginning in order to have a greater opportunity to control her. But the concubines themselves were incredibly happy about the ceremony and prepared very hard for the upcoming reception. Catherine was the one who was most excited about this event and dressed up so beautifully for it. Melanie sat not far from Calyusa and could not understand why the girl considered herself better than her. Pessalini leaned toward Hetzeros and explained that Catherine's position was superior only because she was already Oedipe's fiancée. In response, the girl only laughed loudly, since she had specifically decided to attract attention to herself. She said that a cracked gold coin would be worth much less than a silver one, which was immediately heard first, after which Melanie returned to her preparations as if nothing had happened, even though she had just so easily insulted her competitor. Catherine couldn't help but react to something like this, so she stood up and asked who said it. In fact, she immediately realized that she was talking to Melanie, so she walked up to her and grabbed her face. Calyusa stated that a cracked gold coin could be melted down and would once again be worth more than silver. Hetzeros brushed the lady's offending hand aside, then turned and looked at the other girls for support. But they all, as one, hid their faces down and did not want to get involved in this quarrel between the concubines. Here, Calyusa said that she would explain everything to her rival in an accessible language, and Melanie prepared to fight back. Leaning towards the lady, Catherine declared that she would always be first, and that this would remain unchanged, no matter how anyone wanted it. Miss roughly pushed Hetzeros away and declared that people like her could never equal her no matter how hard they tried. These words made Melanie incredibly angry, but she understood that it would be stupid to continue their quarrel. However, the girl eventually lost her temper and shouted that Catherine was not an empress, so she had fewer rights. But then Raphael entered the room and announced that the ceremony would soon begin, so the concubines should prepare. This is what made Catherine and Melanie stop competing with each other, at least for a while. However, Calyusa still turned to the other girls and told them to treat her as the best. Rose was especially frightened by these words, since she did not at all want to know how heavy her rival's hand was. Clenching her hands tightly into fists, Adelaide thought fearfully about the Empress, against whom all the concubines would be set. The girl didn't want to quarrel with Zelda at all, although their first meeting, quite by chance, didn't go very well. However, the lady did not give up hope that over time the Empress would open her heart to her. In the meantime, Rose was very sad that she had never managed to have a heart-to-heart talk with Fontrov. Looking accidentally into the mirror in front of her, the lady noticed something that she ultimately didn't like about herself. Miss took off one of the ornaments from her head and put it on the table, because she did not want to be beautiful at all. After a very short time, the long-awaited ceremony of accepting concubines began in the temple. As custom required, His Majesty kissed the hand of each of them in turn, thus greeting them, after which the Emperor and all the other concubines placed their hands on the altar to be blessed. For this occasion, the chief priest put on his best cassock and began to read a special blessing prayer. The whole time the prayer was being said, Linnell kept a completely serious face, and it was unclear what he was thinking about. When the priest's words died away, His Majesty was required to kiss each of the girls, so he was incredibly glad that Zelda was outside the temple and didn't see any of this. The girl herself would not have wanted to see everything that was happening at the ceremony because she was already sad. She hadn't gone to eat or sleep anyway, so she didn't want to give herself any more reasons to worry. Nevertheless, Fontrov couldn't help but at least take a look at the temple from the side, so she went out onto the balcony so late. From the outside, it was clear that the ceremony had already ended, so the lady realized that the ruler had gone to see one of the concubines. This was not her personal wish or the emperor's, as the customs of the ceremony required it. So, no matter how sad the lady was, she still decided to go to bed in the hope that she would fall asleep fairly quickly. But then Fontrov heard that someone had come to her, and in spite of everything, hope lit up in the girl's eyes. From the maid's voice, she understood that the assistant would first inform her of the arrival of that night guest. An image of Linnell immediately popped into Zelda's mind, because that was the one she wanted to see right now. So the heroine immediately went out to meet Sharon, although she had not yet had time to properly knock on her door. But for some reason, the assistant didn't look happy at all, which made the Empress a little nervous. It turned out that it was not the Emperor who had arrived, but the Duke, who had requested an audience at this very late hour. Fontrov didn't even believe what she heard at first, which is why her eyes flashed fearfully in the light of the room. Sharon said that she asked about the purpose of the visit, but the guy replied that he would only tell everything to the lady personally. At that moment, the heroine thought hard about how she should ultimately deal with the Duke of Rohain. As a result, the lady said that it was not yet time for sleep and asked for a shawl to be brought to her to wrap herself up. So, literally a few minutes later, the girl came out to meet her uninvited guest. The guy immediately greeted the miss properly and hoped that he had not disturbed her rest too much. Zelda thought silently for a moment, not knowing what course of action she should take. In the end, Fontrova honestly stated that Martins had really bothered her, so she decided to find out why he had come. Rohain asked the Deputy Empress not to be angry, as he decided to keep her company. The heroine did not expect that just for this reason, the Duke would dare to disturb the wife of the Emperor himself so late. The guy himself, clearly not at all nervous, began to drink the tea poured for him by his assistants absolutely calmly. But Zelda couldn't feel the same emotions, so she clenched her hands into fists out of excitement. Martins noticed this quite easily, so he asked the lady not to be nervous, which immediately surprised her. It was only when Rohain suddenly started talking about concubines that Miss realized that it was not about wanting to keep her company. Martins declared that the Emperor would have to spend the night with one of the accepted concubines. Zelda herself knew that this was absolutely normal, but her heart could not accept this state of affairs. Then, to the girl's great surprise, the guy suddenly noticed that she looked upset, which made her freeze in place. Looking at the smug Duke, the heroine concluded that he was actually a very unpleasant person. In order not to drag out this vile dialogue any further, the lady asked directly why the resident of her empire had come to her. But the guy didn't want to reveal his secrets at all, so he said that he just wanted to keep her company. This angered the former maid, so she said that since he saw her reaction, she would go to her room. But as soon as the miss got up to go to the bedroom, suddenly the maid came running to her in a panic. The assistant reported that His Majesty had come to see his wife, which greatly surprised the girl. The lady remembered that the ruler should have been with one of the concubines now, so she did not understand why Edpa came to her. Worried, Zelda turned to the Duke and asked him if Linnell might have learned of their agreement. Suddenly, she heard her husband's voice behind her and turned around in fear, realizing that he had heard her words. Martins also realized that they were a bit in trouble, but he politely greeted the Emperor as if nothing had happened. However, His Majesty was too angry to say anything in response to the Duke's greeting. Fontrov didn't expect Edpa to come into the room so quickly, so she stood next to him with a guilty face. And Linnell at that moment said that he didn't even know that the girl was so close to Rohain from her empire. Zelda tried to soften the atmosphere by saying that they were not as close as her husband thought. In response, His Majesty smiled rather coldly and decided to test the emotions of his Empress. Fontrov was horrified to hear the question of whether she would mind if Edpa ended up killing the Duke right now. Looking at the guy in surprise, the lady admitted that it wasn't such a bad idea after all. However, Miss did not like the fact that if Martins was killed, an even more unpleasant aristocrat might arrive from the Empire. These words immediately brought a smile to the ruler's face, as he did not expect the girl to think like that. And a second later, Linnell couldn't resist and laughed out loud, admitting that the Empress was right. He then placed his hand on Zelda's shoulder, saying that there was indeed meaning in her words, which he would listen to, after which the guy hugged Fontrov and congratulated the Duke on his survival. However, despite his smile, Edpa advised Martins to leave immediately before he changed his mind. Rohain himself was not against running away as quickly as possible, so he nodded and said that he was going to his place. But before leaving, he leaned towards the girl and quietly whispered something very important to her. As a result, Zelda's face was distorted with fear and worry, but she said nothing in response. After the Duke left, Linnell confidently hugged the Empress and said that they were going to the bedroom. As soon as they arrived at the place, the girl could not stand it and asked why the guy came to her and not to the concubine. Edpa admitted that he had indeed broken tradition by finally coming to his Empress's chambers. It was only now that the Emperor realized that all this time Zelda had somehow not stopped thinking about something. He asked if Miss was really that worried that he would go to another, and Miss admitted it with a sigh. These words immediately brought a satisfied smile to His Majesty's face, because he was pleased to hear about this. Coming closer to his wife, the guy asked her to tell him about everything that had worried Zelda during the day. Before the heroine could even say a word, the ruler had already gently laid her on the bed and was easily hanging over her. Fontrov was immediately embarrassed by the closeness and distance that arose between them after these actions. In fact, the lady would like everything to remain as before, without the first night with the concubines. But in that case, Miss didn't see any point in having additional wives like Catherine. Linnell's handsome face appeared before her again, and he had managed to blush a little due to the delicate moment. He suddenly said that it would be impolite for a lady to refuse a kiss from him, which made Zelda feel embarrassed as well. But the same sadness remained in her eyes, because she remembered that she could not hold on to her husband. For some reason, the heroine was increasingly drawn to her temporary husband, which now created problems. Edpa suddenly asked his wife to say only that she did not like the fact that he could spend the night with a concubine. Not wanting to give the Empress even a second to think, the guy suddenly kissed her tenderly. After a short while, the Emperor stepped back and once again asked Zelda to tell him what he wanted to hear. Fontrov was in a very difficult situation right now, because she really didn't want her husband to leave her. But she remembered too well the Duke's words about her having to send Edp to the concubines. So, as difficult as it was for her, Fontrov put her hand on her husband's shoulder, pushing him away a little, after which, with sad eyes, the girl barely audibly whispered that she didn't want all this. Linnell immediately interpreted these words the way he wanted, and therefore smiled happily and blushed a little. He moved closer and kissed the lady again, as he was glad that she did not push him away. Pressing even closer to Zelda, His Majesty asked her to repeat that she did not want him to leave. Fontrov realized that the ruler had guessed her true feelings, but that was not what she needed right now. So, choosing the right moment, Miss repeated her words, saying that she did not want him to stay. Linnell immediately moved away from the Empress and looked at her as if he had just been hit very painfully. His Majesty's eyes became empty and cold, as if he had not just shown all these tender feelings. However, Edpa did not contradict his wife in any way, but instead quickly moved away from her. Having measured Zelda with a sharp and unpleasant look, the ruler said that, since such was her will, he would go to the concubine. As a result, the heroine was left completely alone in such a spacious room, which she really did not want at all. However, she was glad that everything would be fine with Edpa now, because that was what the Duke had told her before he left. The next morning, while walking, Sharon told the lady that she was not sure whether Linnell had visited the concubine. The maid explained that the direction the Emperor took was his usual night walk, but to all the consolations of her assistant, Zelda replied that everything was fine because it was natural. She understood that it was impossible to ignore the wrath of Catherine and the other concubines purely because of her own desires. Because of this, absolutely all ministers would treat her as a foreign empress of the country of Shagonal. It was precisely these kinds of problems for the Emperor that the heroine tried to avoid, no matter what it cost her. So, although she was now sad, Miss considered that she had done the right thing last night as a result. Zelda clasped her hands and tried to console herself with the thought that yesterday's choice had been of great benefit to His Majesty. While they were walking, the lady suddenly turned to the assistant, who did not expect this, so she flinched a little. Moreover, although Fontrov called the maid, she did not immediately say what exactly she wanted from her, because she was lost in thought. Eventually, Miss decided that she wanted to get along well with Linnell, so she asked if he had any business after lunch. Sharon immediately said that the ruler was indeed not busy, and was glad when the lady decided to go to him. So after dinner, the Emperor's personal secretary announced to him that the Empress had unexpectedly come to see him, but Linnell told Zelda to wait because he had a visitor, and she assumed it was one of the ministers. Imagine the heroine's surprise when Raphael reported that Catherine had just entered His Majesty's office. At the same time, the guy was clearly embarrassed to report something like this, although he had to because of his duties. Fontrov immediately imagined the serious face of the concubine, who was determined to seduce Edibai. So the fact that the Empress was a little late ended up upsetting her quite a bit. But in fact, even His Majesty himself did not know that Cagliostro would come to him, so he was also surprised. Then the concubine opened the door herself, because she heard that someone had come, and she immediately became very interested. And Catherine was the only one who didn't get confused in this situation, as she calmly greeted Zelda. Even Fontrov didn't expect that Cagliostro would be able to play the role of a supposedly nice person to everyone so easily. The heroine was very confused at this moment and did not even know how to act in such a situation. Here she met the gaze of Linnell, who was also unhappy about what had just happened. Zelda tried to justify herself and explained that she thought the ruler was alone, which is why she came to him. At this point, Catherine suddenly intervened in the conversation, declaring that the Empress looked especially good today. The former maid did not understand whether the concubine was mocking her now, because the ruler was with her at night. However, just in case, the lady decided to pretend that she didn't understand what was being discussed, so she replied that she had simply had a good night's sleep. But then the girl felt her husband's unpleasant gaze on her and did not understand why he was looking at her like that. Moreover, Cagliostro's reddened eyes hinted that the night between her and the Emperor had been stormy. Suddenly, Catherine turned around and announced that she was just about to leave, so she wouldn't be late. She did not allow him to say a word and quickly walked through the door so that the heroine was left alone with her husband. Zelda decided to take advantage of this chance, as she just wanted to explain yesterday's events to His Majesty. Suddenly, Linnell unexpectedly rudely interrupted Miss and said that he was doing very well if she was interested. These evil words shocked Fontrov so much that she even froze in place, immediately falling silent. In fact, this was not what Miss wanted to ask at all, but she was not sure that it was important now. The girl said that she was worried because she had driven away the ruler, and he loudly put the cup down on the saucer, after which the Emperor, still angrily, promised that he would behave in such a way that the lady would no longer worry. His Majesty invited her to sit down, but the Empress refused, saying that she was probably disturbing him. The heroine reported that she was convinced that the Emperor was in a good mood, and Linnell silently looked at her. Edpa then reminded her that the Miss was about to leave and laughed when she asked his permission to do so. However, the guy still let Zelda go, who did not at all understand the reasons for such behavior on his part. Since Fontrov had more to say, she said that she was indeed leaving for her own place. His Majesty did not answer and did not even look at his wife, remaining standing with his back to her. It was only when she left the door that the lady thought about how she wanted to confess her insincerity of yesterday. But before the Miss had time to feel even a little sad about this, her personal assistant suddenly called out to her. Sharon suggested that the lady explore the Imperial greenhouse, where one could have a good rest. Zelda realized that the maid was trying very hard to help her, so she agreed to this walk with a smile. Although Fontrov didn't say it out loud, she was incredibly grateful to her assistant for such easy help. Before leaving the palace, the lady turned around because she felt like someone was watching them right now. But in the end, she didn't notice anyone, so she calmly walked on, although one of the concubines hid behind the wall. When they arrived at the greenhouse, the Empress was sincerely amazed by its scale and beauty. Sharon admitted that it was also her first time in this place, but she was ultimately pleased with the impression she made. Here, the Empress realized that the maid simply wanted to be there herself, so she laughed at it. Suddenly, she felt someone looking at her from the outside again, which once again made her very tense. Turning around sharply, the lady decided to protect Sharon at all costs, when suddenly she saw Rose in front of her. The heroine immediately remembered that the girl was one of the concubines and was very surprised to see her. It seemed that Adelaide also did not understand how they could have met in the greenhouse at all, since she was very confused. Suddenly, she leaned forward in a polite greeting and formally introduced herself as the Emperor's second concubine. Zelda asked if the lady had come to see the greenhouse too, and she immediately nodded in agreement. Then, in order not to show how surprised she was, the heroine began to chat about all sorts of trifles. Suddenly, Rose called out to Fontrov, and the Empress did not expect to hear that the girl wanted to apologize for something. Adelita explained that she really thought she was allowed to enter her mistress's bedroom that first time. The girl explained that she simply listened to other candidates who said that it was possible to do so. Imagine the surprise of the second concubine when Zelda suddenly said that she did not hold a grudge against her. Emotionally, Rosa admitted that she did not want to be a candidate at all, as she simply loves to read books. Fontrov could not even imagine that this fragile and timid miss had long been studying healing magic books. The Empress promised that she would definitely turn to the second one for help, and this pleased the latter. Here, both girls fell silent, when suddenly Rose looked closely at the Empress's face. Although she said nothing, the heroine noticed that for some reason, the concubine paid attention to the right side of her face. This made the former maid feel very awkward, and she immediately turned away, although she did not understand what had just happened. Zelda knew that the potion's effects weren't supposed to wear off yet, but she still began to worry. But then, suddenly, the first concubine appeared in front of the girls who had almost become friends. For the Fontrovs, this second unexpected meeting was much more unpleasant than the very recent first one. Noticing that Zelda was not alone, Catherine asked Rose if she had already begun to flatter Her Majesty. The girl was very scared and said that she was not trying to flatter anyone, but just wanted to talk. But Cagliostro was furious that Adelaide suddenly addressed her simply by her first name, without due respect. The second concubine realized her mistake too late, for which she asked for forgiveness, saying that she had simply misspoke. Since they were not alone, Rose suggested to the first candidate that they discuss the relationship between them a little later, but Catherine declared that it was time for the lady to get what she deserved and gave her a resounding slap across the face. The current empress was extremely upset to see such behavior from Cagliostro because she did not expect anything like this. Even Adelita couldn't believe that her opponent would actually hit her, so she froze in shock, and Catherine shouted loudly that no one dared to be familiar with her now because of her higher status. Rose, barely holding back tears, said that she said it by accident, since they had been friends once in childhood. Having heard that the girl promised to be more careful next time, the first one was pleased with the effect produced. However, she decided to reinforce what she had learned, so she raised her hand again to hit the lady again. Zelda watched in horror as Cagliostro treated what was essentially her old friend so cruelly. But what angered Fontrov most of all was that the concubine somehow dared to use violence in her presence. At that moment, Rose, in tears, could barely say that she perfectly understood all the words of her rival. Catherine smiled contentedly and said that if Adelita had said so at once, she would not have had to disgrace herself. After which the first one turned and looked at the Empress, who suddenly called her for some reason. The Emperor's wife herself had already fully prepared the conversation with which she would scold the impudent girl. Catherine noticed Zelda's gaze and, smiling at her, apologized for such an introduction. To this, the heroine said emotionlessly that it was the duty of the elders to teach and the duty of the younger ones to perceive information. Cagliostro didn't quite understand why the lady said this, but she agreed that it was completely correct. Then Fontrov, without saying another word, swung her sword and lightly hit the concubine on the cheek. The girl immediately fell to the floor, clutching her head, and her maids ran to her in panic. In fact, the former maid knew the people's target areas very well, so the blow was not strong. She deliberately hit the back of the head with her left hand, so that nothing would end up swelling in the first concubine. After waiting a little, Zelda called the girl and told her to be grateful for her lesson in the end. Noticing that Catherine was still unhappy, Fontrov began to list in turn what she was guilty of. In the end, the Empress smiled falsely and said that next time she would not turn a blind eye to these actions. As a result, Cagliostro whispered hoarsely that next time she would be more careful than now. Finally, Zelda told Rosie that she very much hoped for a more successful next meeting. These words made Adelita very happy, and she was able to smile, even despite the pain in her face. Noticing the lady's joy, the heroine was pleased, since she was afraid that she would end up being afraid of her. At this point, all the Empress's business was finished, so she ordered the maid to return back to the room. Unexpectedly for the heroine, Catherine, still sitting on her knees, screamed that she had gone too far last night. Zelda turned around in surprise and said that she had done nothing to deserve such words. Here, to the great surprise of even Rose, real tears appeared in the eyes of the first concubine, after which the girl also stated, with resentment, that yesterday was supposed to be her first night. Fontrov couldn't even imagine that the emperor ultimately didn't come to the concubine's chambers, although she let him go. The lady said that all decisions were left to Linnell, but Cagliasa demanded to know where he was then. But in this situation, Miss could not help her rival in any way, because she herself did not have the information. When the Empress returned to her chambers, Sharon was surprised and tried to understand where the ruler had been last night. But even his wife could not answer this question, so she remained in the same state of great bewilderment. After all, Zelda had specifically driven out the ruler so that he would be safe, but now she was not sure of that. Unexpectedly, Fontrov told her assistant that she needed to go to the main palace, which surprised her. However, the Empress herself suddenly and confidently declared with a smile that she had decided to see her husband. Moreover, the lady decided to come to the ruler's bedroom today, which was immediately conveyed to him, which made the guy embarrassed. The secretary noted that the gentleman was now more anxious than before the war, and he turned out to be right. His Majesty himself wished that this were not true, but for some reason he could not help himself. In the end, Raphael couldn't stand it any longer and asked Linnell why he was so worried about this situation. But Edpa didn't expect such a question, so he was unprepared for it and looked angrily at his assistant. The secretary calmly shared his thoughts about the fact that for some reason, even during the wedding, the ruler was not worried. But what worried the boy most was that His Majesty was increasingly smiling at inappropriate moments. To this, the gentleman replied that Raph was simply not married yet, but the servant stated that he had more experience anyway. Then the emperor asked the secretary to diagnose him and personally state the reason for such behavior. The guy simply said that, most likely, His Majesty was simply waiting for the next meeting with his wife. After this, Linnell admitted that his assistant's words made his heart beat even faster and more anxiously. Raphael asked if Edpa was worried about the lady visiting his bedroom, and the ruler asked him to be silent. The emperor admitted that he began to blush terribly every time he thought about such things. Then the servant remembered that no woman had ever visited His Majesty's bedroom before. This realization made Linnell feel even worse. But now he wasn't at all angry at the secretary who was pressuring his emotions. The assistant himself suddenly smiled faintly and said that today would truly be a historic day. That evening, although Zelda was very red with excitement, she still did not change her mind about coming to her husband. Fontrov was noticeably nervous because she really didn't know what to expect from this meeting with the emperor. Suddenly, Sharon asked the lady if she was really okay, and the lady realized that the maid was very worried. However, the lady did not lie and honestly said that she was worried, but was not going to back down. The assistant immediately began to support the Empress, who felt at least a little better because of this. So the heroine smiled and told the girl to relax, because she was already feeling much calmer. Here the lady turned and accidentally came face to face with the Emperor, whom she had not expected to see so soon. Linnell also became noticeably embarrassed and said that he had not met the miss at all, but was simply returning from his walk. The girl immediately realized that the guy was evading the answer, when suddenly he extended his hand straight towards her. Edpa, despite his face being pink from the emotions that overwhelmed him, personally invited the Empress to him. Zelda was very pleased with such attention from His Majesty, so she extended her hand in return. Leaving Sharon behind, they both walked through the corridors of the Imperial Palace towards Edpa's private bedroom. Here, to the lady's surprise, Linnell suddenly asked for what purpose the girl had suddenly decided to come to his bedroom. When she answered quite calmly that she had come to sleep, the Emperor blushed deeply, despite such a simple answer. After which, the miss added that she would like to talk a little more, and this greatly interested her husband. He squeezed the girl's hand even tighter to feel her warmth, but tried not to cause pain. Noticing this, Fontrov smiled gratefully at the Emperor, since she liked his concern. But Linnell wasn't ready to look the Empress in the eye at the moment, so he awkwardly turned away. Imagine the heroine's surprise when the guy suddenly admitted that she was the first woman to enter his bedroom. He suddenly added that he was going to throw his wife on the bed as soon as she entered the room. Zelda understood perfectly well what kind of physical dialogue His Majesty was hinting at, because she was not against it. But then Linnell confessed that he was very afraid that Miss would push him away, so he couldn't do that. Fontrov asked the guy just in case if he really wanted it, and he replied that he wanted it madly. These sincere and passionate words made the heroine blush even more, from incredible embarrassment. To hide this, the girl turned away and suggested that they just sit and talk first. However, when they both sat down on the bed, the Empress felt the sudden silence that had arisen for some reason. Zelda only now realized that she wanted to see the Emperor so much that she couldn't even think of what to say. Unable to bear it, the lady suddenly glanced at Linnell, because she wanted to understand what he himself was feeling at the moment and how he was behaving. But then, with an unexpectedly light and skillful movement, the ruler threw off part of his wife's outerwear. Then, without stopping at all, the guy began to take off her shoes, which completely shocked the miss. She tried to remind him that they wanted to talk, to which Linnell replied that the most sincere dialogue only happens in bed. At this moment, one of the concubines was properly perfumed in order to prepare for the meeting with His Majesty. It was Melanie, and she was already in anticipation and could not wait for the Emperor to come to her. Here the maids approached Hetzros, who had not the most pleasant news for the still cheerful miss. But it was too hard for the assistants to tell what they knew, so they mumbled for a long time on the spot. Then the concubine indignantly asked when the ruler would finally come to her, since she was waiting so much. But then the maids were able to report that Linnell was spending time with Zelda, which greatly shocked Melanie. At that moment, without thinking at all about the concubines, the ruler kissed his wife's tender foot with pleasure. When he suddenly got up and went out, Fontrov anxiously asked the guy to at least wait a little. Only right now, His Majesty was so absorbed in the process that he did not hear the girl. But the heroine herself could not tolerate such an attitude, since it was beyond her patience. So, completely instinctively, the miss gave the Emperor a light kick, causing him to fall onto the bed. It was so unexpected for the guy that he didn't even have time to defend himself. He just opened his eyes wide. Only a few seconds later, Zelda realized what she had done and began to apologize for her actions. Miss asked if Edpa was okay and explained that she had just been very ticklish and couldn't help herself. In response, the Emperor silently looked at his wife, but his eyes were not cold or condemning. Suddenly, Linnell, still silently, turned away, showing the lady the back of his head and back for some reason. The girl shuddered nervously and hesitantly reminded her husband that she had not come here today for this reason. Suddenly, the guy grumbled discontentedly that he hadn't just kissed her tenderly to kick her in the face. After a few seconds, the ruler finally admitted that he was not offended, but simply felt awkward. The heroine still believed that part of the blame for what happened was definitely on her, so she didn't know what to say. To Linnell's great surprise, the girl suddenly said that he would probably no longer visit her chambers. These words made Edpa jump up and ask if the miss would like this, but she answered in the negative. The heroine explained that she had made a big mistake, so she would not be surprised if her husband did the same. But then he suddenly announced that he would come to her more often, which made Zelda's heart skip a beat in joy. Linnell was serious and said that he would visit his wife until he kissed her from head to toe, after which he got as close as possible to the girl and asked why she had actually come to his bedroom today. Then Zelda was finally able to admit that she had felt uneasy the previous night when her husband left the room. Gently squeezing the lady's hand, Linnell asked if she shouldn't be even more uncomfortable in his bedroom. Here, Fontrov admitted that she wanted to see the Emperor, which immediately brought a pleasant smile to his face. He whispered that he was glad to finally hear it, and then asked what he should do with her on his bed. Unexpectedly for herself, the heroine was the first to reach out for a kiss, although she was not allowed to do this. This time, even Edpa himself was surprised by such pressure, and asked the Empress to slow down a little. However, Miss was already completely overwhelmed by her own emotions, so she could not stop. Fontrov even personally began to take off His Majesty's clothes, although before that, she had not dared to even think about such a thing. Looking at the girl's completely red face, the guy thought that he didn't want to stop either. During those few minutes of their kiss, Linnell became very aroused, as he really had feelings for his wife. So now that she had finally reciprocated his feelings, the ruler could not control himself either. Unexpectedly for the spouses, they overdid it in their emotions so much that Edpa accidentally tore the sleeve of Zelda's dress. The boy and girl froze in surprise because of this, as the sound scared them quite a bit as a result. But then Fontrov suddenly laughed and asked to rip the sleeve so that it wouldn't just hang around. The Emperor was embarrassed by what had happened, so he immediately obeyed the lady, just so that she would not get angry. Looking at Zelda, the guy was amazed when she suddenly began to carefully take off all her clothes. To avoid further embarrassment, Lenil said that he would now turn off the light and got out of bed for a while. Literally a few seconds later, the couple found themselves back on the bed and in each other's long-awaited embrace. But before they could take any action, the secretary rushed into the room in a hurry after knocking. He announced that Melanie had suddenly fallen seriously down the stairs, which greatly alarmed the imperial couple. So, quite quickly, His Majesty got ready and came to the room of the lady, who must now be feeling ill. And indeed, Hetsros was lying on the bed, her eyes closed, and paying no attention to anything around her. But as soon as they announced to her that Lenel had arrived, the concubine immediately jumped up as if nothing had just happened. Imagine the surprise of the injured girl when in the passage she saw not only the ruler she had been waiting for. For some reason, Zelda came into the room with Edpa, so Melanie asked in disappointment what she was. His Majesty's face visibly darkened when he heard his concubine address his wife in such a disrespectful manner. Melanie immediately pretended that she didn't understand what she had said, because she fell and hit her head. Lenel then explained that Zelda had come with him because she was very worried about the situation with the stairs. But in fact, the guy himself suggested that Fontrov go with him, although the lady did not want any of this at all. Hetsros winced when Edpa said he heard she was dying from a recent fall down the stairs. Putting on a sweet face, the concubine began to assure that this was the case until she woke up a few seconds ago. The lady shared that she was waiting for the ruler, as he was supposed to come to her, went out the door, and fell. Imagine Melanie's surprise when Lenel suddenly declared that this whole situation was extremely stupid. Zelda couldn't get over the Emperor's words, that Melanie looked a bit like a horse because of her laughter. Edpa asked what exactly had happened to the concubine, and the maid explained that she had injured her leg. Listening to all this dialogue, Fontrov could hardly restrain herself from laughing out loud at the absurdity of the situation. Finally, the heroine informed her husband that she would be the first to go back and return to her room as quickly as possible, after which she smiled at Melanie and asked the lady to be careful, since she was one of the Emperor's wives. The Empress's desire was to escape from this room, when suddenly her husband grabbed her left shoulder in an attempt to stop her. The girl didn't have time to react, and so the cape fell off, revealing the recently torn sleeve. This circumstance made the lady very embarrassed, since she could not walk around like that. Hetsros immediately noticed this and asked with horror what had happened to the Empress's dress. In the end, Zelda stood there silently, having no idea how to explain everything that was happening now. But then Lenel came to his wife's aid, declaring that it was a fashionable and beautiful design straight from her empire. The heroine didn't understand who could believe such a thing, but she saw Melanie's burning and interested gaze, so she kept silent. Suddenly, the ruler told the concubine to rest after the stress she had experienced, and they would go on for now. Although Hetsros shouted something after her, no one answered her, as the couple went into the beautiful imperial garden. Zelda was pleased that Lenel was so persistent in keeping her company wherever she was, even though Miss had offended him last night. Edpa suddenly said that they were returning to his chambers, and this decision was not subject to any discussion. After which, the guy explained that he couldn't just let go of the first and last guest in his bedroom so easily. After kissing his wife, Edpa pulled away for a short moment and promised that she would come here often. A couple of minutes later, the boy and girl reached the imperial bed again and continued from where they had left off. Zelda was again pleasantly embarrassed and even excited by everything that was happening, but she did not want to stop. Looking straight into the guy's eyes, Miss noticed that they told her that he really valued her. This pleased Fontrov very much, and she could not even imagine that she would fall so deeply in love with the Emperor. Moreover, Edpa saw exactly the same emotions in the eyes of the girl, who was experiencing exactly the same thing as he was. For the first time in a long time, they actually shared a bed together, and neither of them regretted it. The next morning, when the sun had risen enough to illuminate the room, the ruler was still in bed. Despite the affairs of state, He really wanted to feel this pleasant moment as long as possible. With every light and gentle touch to the Empress, the guy became much calmer and happier. Linnell himself understood perfectly well that the more he looked at the girl, the more he began to love her. He also liked the way Zelda looked at him intently when she tried to argue and prove her point, and the way the lady's pink eyes dart around in different situations due to embarrassment or awkwardness at the moment. For some reason, it was in Fontrov that everything was absolutely new and very interesting for His Majesty. After their first failed wedding night, Edpa's cold dreams finally became much warmer. Remembering the soft and gentle smile of the Empress, Linnell realized that it gave him a long-forgotten feeling of happiness. So at some point, Edpa even came to the conclusion that living without her for even one day would be extremely unbearable for him. Suddenly smiling at his thoughts, the Emperor decided that the miss was actually very shy. He gently stroked Zelda's face once again, because he couldn't stop, because he liked it. Only when he pressed his wife closer to him did the ruler ask himself whether this was really that love. Taking advantage of the fact that Fontrov was sleeping and did not move away embarrassedly, Linnell kissed her on the forehead and continued to lie next to her. But in fact, at that moment, the heroine was having not very pleasant dreams about her childhood and eye damage. When the curse was first placed on her, the girl cried for days on end, not knowing what to do now. Periodically, the baby's eye would start to hurt very badly again, and all she could do was silently endure it. Suddenly, on one of those nights, the girl saw some kind of incomprehensible bright and fiery glow in front of her. It was so sudden that Zelda even forgot about her pain and stared at the thing in surprise. And the unusual-looking ball, clearly made of flame, suddenly spoke and said that it had been looking for the girl for a very long time all this time. Fontrov moved away from the object in fear, and therefore did not hear who exactly she was destined to become according to him. After talking a little with the little girl, who did not answer him, the ball approached her and eventually passed through her body. Although Zelda was scared, she reassured herself that it was just a dream and nothing terrible had happened. Moreover, despite the tears in her eyes, the heroine no longer felt any pain or anxiety inside herself. It even seemed to her that someone big and strong extended his hand for support, and she suddenly took it. Because of such a colorful and slightly frightening dream, Zelda opened her eyes too quickly this morning. She immediately discovered that she was completely alone in the room, as His Majesty had already left again. Not understanding what was happening to her in her sleep, the Empress jumped up in bed in confusion. Despite being engulfed in flames, Miss touched herself and realized that she was not hot at all. The heroine wasn't sure about this, but she assumed that she felt good because she had spent the night with her husband. Remembering this, the girl could not help but smile sincerely, thinking that today would be a good day. At this moment, the ruler was training hard to fight with swords, as he was not going to abandon this business. To Linnell's great surprise, his teacher suddenly asked what had happened to His Majesty. A former captain of a knightly squad named Macrom became blind and therefore stopped performing his military duties on the battlefield. He noticed that Edpa was fighting harder today than ever before, and the Emperor explained that it was simply because he had built up his strength. The guy himself desperately tried to convince himself that this was really all that mattered. However, literally a few seconds later, Linnell turned away and admitted that there was something else. Macrom did not expect his master to speak of the bed, where passion flares up despite the expenditure of energy. The man asked if the Emperor was talking about the Empress, and Edpa did not expect the knight to guess correctly again, after which the assistant stated that Zelda was clearly special, which once again surprised the ruler. But Macrom explained that he simply felt everything that he had just told His Majesty. Moreover, the former commander even knew that all this time, Linnell had been fighting with his eyes closed. To this, the Emperor replied that the knight had definitely regained his sight. Otherwise, how could he have known about all this? Since their dialogue ended there, Linnell, still looking suspiciously at his assistant, began to get ready. Suddenly, the captain said that a new outstanding swordsman had recently appeared in the palace. Elpa was surprised to hear that the knight had been feeling this powerful aura ever since Zelda appeared. The Emperor immediately assumed that there must be someone among the lady's retinue who possessed such power. But His Majesty found it hard to believe that Duke Rohain could be so good at this. Here the knight suggested to the boy that his wife herself could be such a skilled swordsman. His Majesty stared at the former commander in amazement, as this did not fit into his head. In the end, he declared that Macrom had lost not only his sight, but also his common sense, since he was saying something like that. However, Linnell himself smiled when he remembered how deftly the lady had accidentally kicked him yesterday. At that moment, the girl was walking among the sunflowers, completely carefree, and the Emperor walked towards her. Duke Martins only just now learned that Zelda herself personally visited the ruler's chambers last night. The guy didn't like this at all, because initially he and the former maid had other agreements. His bodyguard delicately asked whether the gentleman would report all this to Prince Tesler. But, remembering the actions of the Emperor and his current wife, Rohine did not know how to tell about it. At this point, Rolf pulled something out of his pocket and said that he had met with Hale's personal bodyguard the previous night. He handed the small box to the Duke and said that it had been ordered to be given to the Emperor by Rapian. Martins took the box in his hands in surprise and asked if Prince Tesler had given anything else. Only now did Rolf remember that certain words had indeed been said to him. Only when the ruler opens the box will he be able to understand what the full meaning of what was inside was. These words surprised the guy a lot, so he decided to personally check what was inside. As a result, Rohine froze in horror from what he saw and realized that Linnell would now respect personal boundaries.